Good day, everyone. Adverse impact of cyber crimes into the Middle East region is growing at 14% per annum and expected to accelerate, driven by hype of digital presence in the region. As of 2023, $8 million were lost out of cybercrime activities. Thus, the urge to intervene and protect businesses from failure. At Saab RDS, we are committed to connected businesses into a world of innovative technologies. As a boutique technology engineering house, we source, tailor, and deploy latest innovations to empower businesses achieve their objectives. We launched our operation in 2019 into the region, and ever since we celebrate the growing success with the clients in aerospace and defense, educational, research, energy, and automotive sector. At Saab RDS, we pride our continual pursuit for excellence, constantly developing our capabilities in line with a rising challenge and evolving technologies. From software-defined radio to radars to automated test equipment, research and development systems, and cybersecurity. This enabled us in the past years to partner with key companies in the region and in Saudi Arabia, such as Advanced Electronics Company, Saudi Arabian Military Industries, Saudi Aramco, big universities in the region like King Saud University, King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals, KAUST, on their digitization journey. And today, and within the same vision of innovation excellence delivered at speed, we are here with the Gradient to talk about the alarming challenges of cybersecurity. As said by His Excellency during his speech at the G20 summit in Japan, AI and the Internet of Things are evolving innovations with unlimited growth prospects. At the same time, this may produce new challenges of increasing the risks of cybersecurity and information flow. These challenges need to be addressed urgently to avoid turning into economic and social crisis. Here are some interesting cases for cyber attacks that led for big losses. And first example is a healthcare company in Saudi where the hackers obtained more than 200 gigabytes of private patient names, numbers, credit cards, and test results, which were published. Also, another example where hackers demand from big and the world's largest oil company more than 1 terabyte of data and place it on the darknet. Also, in 2017, cyber attack on a petrochemical plant where hackers launched malware that was sent not to only shut down the power plant, but cause an explosion. The only reason why the tragedy did not happen was a small mistake in the malware code. So really, there is an urgency to protect, and we should all protect our businesses. Thus, we have our speaker today, Mr. Chris White, COO of Gradient Technologies. Hello, Mr. Chris. How are you?
Hello. I'm very well. Thank you. Excited to be here.
We are glad to have you with us today. As a leader in the cybersecurity industry, the mic is yours.
Oh, well, thank you very much. So again, my name is Chris White. I've been practicing cybersecurity for almost 20 years now. began my career working in the United States, primarily for several of their intelligence community agencies, building secure systems. I then spent about 5 years building out the security platforms for many large global Fortune 500 companies, focusing primarily on incident response. So in the wake of very large headline breaches, many of which folks have read about and seen news years after the fact, we built their next generation cybersecurity platforms to make sure these attacks didn't happen again. And most recently, I've joined Gradient, where we have an innovation to prevent what we know to be the largest source of cybersecurity attacks. And so we'll talk a little bit about these types of attacks, digital credential attacks, how they occur, why they're so prevalent, and some ways we can start thinking about addressing those.
Excellent, excellent. Nice, Chris, and glad to hear that. So, Mr. Chris, what are the most common types of cyber attacks faced by
Yeah.
organizations today?
Yes, it's actually a dirty little secret. Let me quickly share a slide that may illustrate this very well. So if you look at virtually every breach, and depending on who you talk to, most experts will tell you that 100% of cybersecurity attacks involve a stolen credential. But if you're a skeptic, then at the very least, 85% of them, by reports from Ponemon, Verizon, Microsoft, and others, originate from these stolen digital credentials. And essentially, what we see, if you look at any of these breaches, and even if you go back 10, 20, or 30 years, is that at some point during the attack, the attacker was able to gain access to an environment, maybe through phishing, maybe through injection of malware, maybe through a vulnerability in the perimeter of the network. But at some point, after that attacker gained access, they were able to identify and exploit a vulnerable digital credential. That credential allowed them to assume a privileged role, obtain access to data, to move laterally throughout the organization between different systems and accumulate more and more privilege. And then this enabled them to conduct whatever their deed was, whether it was data exfiltration at scale, whether it was ransom of data through ransomware encryption technology, whatever the case may be, it was enabled by stealing a digital credential to allow them to gain the access necessary to do this terrible thing. And if you look, some of the largest and most sophisticated organizations, even those technology organizations who are in the business of selling secure digital identities, the likes of Microsoft, the likes of technology giant Okta, who is one of their main competitors in the identity space, even they have been breached. And what's worse, the root cause of their breach was digital credentials. You can see that Microsoft had executives' passwords compromised. They had token theft, which in 2023, almost a year ago, not quite, led to access of US federal government individuals, several members of Congress, including high-level members of Congress responsible for relationships and strategies related to China, as well as the email accounts for several federal agencies, all of which stemmed from one Microsoft engineer having his or her credentials compromised on their device, stolen and used to impersonate that engineer. So it's a tremendous vulnerability that virtually every company has, and nobody has a good solution to until now.
Excellent, excellent, Mr. Chris. So I want to ask you, why is the multi-factor authentication, the MFA, not considered sufficient alone in preventing security breaches?
That's a great question. So before I talk about multi-factor authentication, we'll talk about what came first, which is passwords. We don't have to spend a lot of time here because I haven't met anybody who believes that passwords are truly secure. We know that when we use them, we give them over to an application, Those applications have breaches, passwords are stolen, they're leaked, they're intercepted through social engineering techniques like phishing, for example. And so it's very, very hard to take even the most secure password you can think of or generate randomly and keep it a secret. So we know there's a problem there. And as you said, the industry tried to address this by adding an additional layer. So a second factor, or sometimes even a third factor, to go alongside the password to make sure that it's harder to compromise that individual's identity. So what we've seen with multi-factor authentication is that it too is vulnerable. So again, with Microsoft, starting in 2022, they began reporting that they saw over 10,000 of their customers just in 2022 running multi-factor authentication globally across the entire enterprise. And yet, over 10,000 of those organizations with multi-factor authentication were able to be compromised through a very specific type of attack called adversary in the middle. This used to be called man in the middle. It's essentially a method that uses phishing to get a user to click a link. The link takes them from the user's perspective to a legitimate application like Microsoft Office 365, like Google G Suite or Gmail or Calendar, LinkedIn, Facebook, all of these applications. And what happens is the user inputs their credentials in a way that the attacker is able to see. The attacker is also able to see what the application they're trying to log into sends back to the user. The adversary then intercepts the traffic going both from the user to the application and from the application to the user. They're then able to steal the credential token that's issued by the application and replay it to the user. We can walk through a demonstration of exactly how this works in a little bit. But first, what I'd like to explain is 2022 was the year that 10,000 organizations were breached, just from Microsoft's perspective. That's just what they were able to see with their customer base. That number has more than doubled every year since then. And again, this is only within the purview of Microsoft, which is a truly large global organization with many, many customers, but is only within their purview. The actual numbers, if we go into broader ecosystems outside of the Microsoft universe, are substantially larger. And adversary in the middle is not the only way to defeat multi-factor authentication. Microsoft, Okta, and other companies have advanced forms of multi-factor authentication available to them that they tout as able to resist adversary in the middle attacks. They were running these technologies internally when they suffered credential breaches. They suffered a specific form of breach known as token theft. And this is where an adversary is able to land on a device, remain undetected using a form of malware, and several vulnerabilities in the operating systems and sometimes the browser as well, and is able to steal the token issued to that device directly from the device and then exfiltrate it very slowly off the device. So this is the form of attack that was able to compromise both Microsoft and Okta and lead to these extremely negative events. So that is the short version of why multi-factor authentication is no longer sufficient to protect any organization.
Excellent. Okay, Chris. So, based on what you were saying, can you explain the concept of adversary in the middle, the AITM attacks, and how they occur?
Absolutely. So this is perhaps a little disturbing. I'm going to show a quick demonstration here. Bear with me 1 second while we load it up. And let me explain what we're looking at before we get into the actual discussion. So there are three parties in an adversary in the middle attack. There is a victim who could be a consumer or could be an employee of any business or any government organization that you can think of. There is an attacker, and the attacker only needs one simple tool. This tool is freely available to anyone in the world. It is posted publicly on GitHub, It is a tool called Evil Jinx, and it is extremely easy to use. You can teach yourself how to use it with zero engineering or zero coding experience. All you need to be able to do is watch a YouTube video and repeat the commands that they show you in the YouTube video. This demo I'm about to show you was stood up by myself and one other grading engineer in approximately 3 hours. And frankly, most of the time did not go into the actual attack. Most of the time went into making the video look pretty. So it is extremely easy for anybody to do with very little barriers to entry. So not a lot of education required. So the last and final piece of the adversary in the middle of attack is the service. That is what the user is trying to access. In this example, we show Microsoft Office 365. But what we'll see is that the tool, Evil Jinx, when you download it from the internet, is actually capable of right off the shelf, right from when you download it freely from GitHub, it is able to compromise multiple different applications. You can see those listed out here, these so-called fishlets. So Amazon logins for your consumer shopping, Amazon Web Services logins, one login, single sign-on, Okta single sign-on, Facebook, WordPress, you name it. All of these pieces listed here on the left are applications that this tool can attack without any programming knowledge. And if you see an application that is not listed here, any of these authors listed right next to those applications are often available to create a configuration to attack that application that you don't see listed here. They will do it for free in many cases, and they will certainly do it if you pay them in crypto dollars. So what Evil Jinx does is it creates what they call a fishlet. The fishlet is a link. It's a hyperlink. It's a URL that all you need to do is purchase a lookalike domain for the application you're trying to attack. As I mentioned, we're attacking Microsoft Office 365. So we purchased, if you look over here in host name, the domain office with an AW, because this is a silly demonstration. If we were really trying to fool people, we would use Cyrillic characters to make it look exactly like the word office.com. So this is a standard phishing email. You can imagine that this user is busy. This user has done all the training in the world, but unfortunately, this user doesn't see that there's a misspelling in office. So they click the link. And what's important here is that they are currently experiencing the actual login to MicrosoftOffice.com. They are doing so through the adversary's proxy on the same server that is running Evil Jinx. So you can see here, the only key is the URL at the top up here, which says office with an AW instead of an O. That is the only reason you would suspect anything, and the user didn't notice that when they clicked it, so why would they notice it in the browser? So the user is currently logging into Microsoft through this office proxy malicious URL. So they put in their password, and we'll see that they, after they put in their password, they put in their multi-factor authentication. In this case, they're using the text message-based authentication. However, that is not a vulnerability in this particular example. They could be using Microsoft Authenticator app. They could be using virtually any form of secondary authenticator that you can imagine, and it would still be vulnerable. So the user input their password and they input their second factor via text message. What did the attacker see? The attacker is dumping a session, and they've seen that there's a lot of data the attacker was able to get. The first thing to note is the username up here, pat@company.com. We see that the user's password was captured, but most importantly, we see what Microsoft sent back to this user through this attacker's proxy. This string of white characters is the credential. This is the access token credential that Microsoft sent back to the user after saying, okay, you've authenticated, I now trust you. But the adversary was able to intercept it because they're using this malicious proxy in the tool. All the attacker has to do is copy that string of characters into his browser, again, all on one machine. This is on one server that the attacker has access to, running Evil Jinx, running this proxy, running this browser. And now look, the attacker is Pat. He has successfully replayed this token and has logged in as Pat into the Microsoft environment. And that is end of days for Pat. His identity has been compromised. This attacker can now use whatever application is integrated with the Microsoft environment as this user. So I will pause there.
Excellent, interesting, Mr. Chris. In this case, what are the limitations of traditional security solutions like FIDO2 and
Yeah,
biometrics in securing credential tokens?
that is an excellent question. So let's talk a little bit about advanced multi-factor authentication. I mentioned that Okta, Microsoft, and other advanced organizations run this next generation of multi-factor authentication. And many users may have heard of passkeys. So passkeys are a new replacement for passwords that are supposed to be better, in many cases, more secure and more enjoyable to use. But what we've seen is that they are not more enjoyable for many users. We have even seen proposals or requests for proposals from US federal agencies requesting replacements for passkeys, and they were just released recently by the 4 big technology giants. So what you see with these advanced forms of multi-factor authentication is rejection from the user base. Requires a physical token key to be plugged into the device. The user has to interact with that token in a specific way. Sometimes it involves a biometric, which may or may not be intrusive to the user from an experience perspective. So what we see is that there is often a very negative impact on the user for how they're able to interact with these advanced forms of multi-factor authentication. But what we've also seen is that even though these do a better job of thwarting the adversary in the middle, making it much harder for that adversary to intercept the credential token in transit as it passes over the wire to the user's device, FIDO2 and related standards do nothing to protect the token once it lands on the device. So if you're authenticating to Microsoft using single sign-on or just going into office.com, it will send you a token and it will just assume that your device knows how to protect that. And we've seen that's exactly how Microsoft was compromised. Malware was able to steal that token and take it off the device and replay it everywhere. And you saw exactly what those tokens look like. They're just a string of characters. It's a really big password. That is the problem, is that if you get access to that password, and it's very easy to do, your session with that application can be replayed on any device in the world, including a malicious device. And unfortunately, FIDO2 does not have an answer to that. And so that is the major drawback that we see with the most so-called secure and advanced solutions, alongside the negative impact to users and not enjoying the experience associated with using those technologies. Next question.
Excellent. So, Chris, I have a question.
Yes.
How is the global regulatory environment changing in terms of cybersecurity responsibilities for companies?
This is an excellent question. Unfortunately, it's moving very quickly. So I'll highlight just a few regulations that we hear from our customers in North America, as well as in Europe. But this is a global trend. We are seeing this in every region across the world, including Asia, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, you name it. So what we've seen is there is a desire to move away from all of the existing paradigms. So we don't want authentication, even with FIDO2, to be a static one-time process, meaning I go through a ceremony to tap something, to pull out my phone, to prove to you that I am who I say I am, only to receive this vulnerable credential token, which can be stolen, and that thing sits around on my device for days. The default is still 90 days for most Microsoft and other applications. That is a long time for an adversary to be able to get on your device, find the token and steal it, and then reuse it before it expires. And so the desire is, can we make authentication continuous? Can we pull in telemetry from the device to prove the device is still trustworthy? And if the device or the user at the device, or the combination of those two things, becomes no longer trustworthy, can we then immediately detect that and revoke access? This is this notion of zero trust. So I want to make sure that if I ever call into question your user at that device and the integrity between those two things, I can revoke that access and you can't become a danger to my organization anymore, and it's virtually instantaneous. So we've seen that the US Department of Defense has mandated a movement to this. They have specifically requested that signals from the device be incorporated into a continuous decision to evaluate whether or not an asset, like an endpoint, is still trustworthy. And if it's not, they'd like to see immediate revocation of access from that device and that user. We've seen similar trends with artificial intelligence. So we have seen that there is deep concern around artificial intelligence and its ability to conduct cybersecurity attacks. So how do we know if an entity attempting to authenticate is truly a user and their device, or a sophisticated attack from an artificial intelligence able to mimic those things extremely effectively? We've also seen regulations emerge from the SEC in the US, in particular for global organizations, which states that every organization must have at least one board member with cyber experience who is in charge of cybersecurity for the company from a board perspective. We've seen that they're also requiring that there are annual filings discussing what the company does to mitigate risk for their cybersecurity program. And more importantly, if there are any attacks to that organization, they need to be disclosed within 4 days, and a detailed discussion of what was done to remediate and remove the risk from that breach. And we've seen that they're already holding organizations to account here. So organizations that do not disclose breaches, that do not describe what they're doing to make sure such breaches never happen again, are having a hard time complying with this. And personally, I don't necessarily blame all organizations. If we've said the root cause of many of these cyber attacks is that digital credentials are fundamentally vulnerable, and there is not a good solution, FIDO2 from Microsoft and Okta aren't the solution and aren't going to help, then it's very hard to come up with a remediation plan to say what you're going to do to prevent the next one. Are you going to buy more of the same technology that you know to be vulnerable, that you know led to attacks of the very companies that sell them? This is a very difficult situation for folks to be in. So we need disruption. We need innovation to help these regulations become easier to comply with for organizations everywhere in the globe, not just in North America, certainly not just in the United States. Anything that I can
Excellent.
clarify there, Mike?
Okay, Chris. So with all this risk, we see that we need a new approach. So what are new approaches and what is a better way to manage this digital credential effectively?
That is a good question. So what we believe good looks like is a paradigm shift in what we're currently doing. And I've mentioned this when I was describing zero trust mandates and changes in the regulatory environment. But fundamentally, what we need to see is that authentication becomes continuous. It uses the devices that users have with them every day. I have my phone with me every day. It's very rare that I don't also have my laptop with me or my iPad and such things. So if these things are tightly coupled with the users, then they should be very central to the decision on whether or not we trust the user and we trust that connection. So we need to see that these devices are being used, and we need to see that we know we can trust those devices before we allow any user to gain access from them. But this needs to be simple. We can't put a burden on the user. We can't ask them to plug in a key and tap it the right way, and if they tap it the wrong way, they're locked out. We can't ask users to do more, because the more we ask them to do, the more frustration we introduce, and frustration is one of the key areas that attackers like to exploit. They can find a way to see a user being frustrated, they can give them a workaround that allows them to be compromised. So the less the user has to do, the better it is for the user, and the better it is for owners of the enterprise who have those users. So we need to minimize what they're doing, We also need to make this not onerous for the organizations. We don't want to suggest they buy outrageously expensive tools or do what we call forklift upgrades, where, for example, you look at Google, who essentially invented the zero trust paradigm when they were breached in 2009. They spent 3 years completely re-architecting their network and billions of dollars, but they're Google. They have the ability to do virtually anything, and they were still young then. This is not something most organizations can do. And so we can't ask them to re-architect their networks with multi-year plans and massive overhauls. It's unreasonable. And at the same time that we can't ask users to do more and we can't ask organizations to do more, we need to eliminate these breaches. And so this all goes back to making sure that when digital credentials are issued, we stop using these insecure tokens. We need to use something that is bound to the devices that users have with them every day, cryptographically bound, so that attackers cannot remove these credentials from devices. But the other key piece there is, before you go and bind a credential to a device, you'd better make sure that device is trustworthy. And that's where those device signals, making sure that you are reading the device to understand, is it in a trustworthy state? Is it worthy of obtaining a credential and obtaining access or not? Because if it's not, it should never be granted a credential or access in the first place. And if it falls out of trust, that access needs to be revoked immediately, as soon as possible, so that malicious activity cannot occur.
So, okay, Chris. So, can you describe us or give us a case study where a new solution for digital credentials was successfully implemented
Yes.
and integrated?
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll take a case study of an organization that we know very well. This is a highly elite technical institute. And I use the term institute because there are many components of this organization. There is a world-renowned educational component where they have thousands of undergraduate students. They have even more graduate students. These students come from all over the globe for one of the best technological educations that you can get anywhere in the world. But they also have tens of thousands of employees and staff that run advanced research laboratories that conduct research for many different organizations, including the US federal government. And so from that federal government work, they are now required to comply with a very deep set of cybersecurity rules and regulations called CMMC. This is something you see all over the world, where if you are taking money from a government, you need to show that you are protecting their investment from a cybersecurity standpoint. So increasingly stringent rules for this organization, but also a very, very advanced threat profile. Again, this is a globally renowned organization. The best students from all over the world attend here. And so you combine that level of prestige with the advanced research and the amount of money associated with this particular institute, you attract some of the most sophisticated adversaries. You attract nation states who are interested in stealing research. You attract advanced cyber criminals who are interested in all of the money associated with this organization's operations. And what we also saw with this organization is that their users hated passwords and wanted the passwords to go away. This was coming not from the office of the CISO, not from the office of the CIO, but from the office of the faculty, who said, this is a mess. This is intrusive. This is disruptive. This takes time away from my day and my ability to publish papers, my ability to conduct research, and even my ability to educate students. So these passwords are a mess. I'm tired of them. I want them to go away. And I hate this multi-factor authentication. It's intrusive. I get kicked out. I don't bring my phone with me, and then I'm locked out for hours on end. We heard examples of millions of dollars being spent just on password lockouts, just on lost passwords or theft of passwords by malicious adversaries. We also heard stories of years where this particular organization had multi-million dollars of losses from fraud because a credential was able to be stolen because of a password compromise, because of adversary in the middle, and then access was gained to financial systems to conduct fraud. And so clearly they needed to make a change. Their threat was too high, the solutions they had weren't working, and they had to show that they were doing something for, at the very least, their federal government regulators. And so the first thing that they did was use technology to strengthen device identity, including bring your own devices. So there are hardware roots of trust present on all devices used these days. They used gradient technology in this case to use those roots of trust to identify devices so they had an accurate inventory of everybody who's connecting to their network in a privacy preserving way. You don't need to know anything about the user. You just need to know, do they have a secure hardware root of trust that is running in a secure state? Because if it is capable of getting issued a credential and protecting it. If it's not, you can't trust that device and you don't want it connecting to your network. So they use strong device identity, and then they use that same hardware root of trust to bind credentials issued to the users to those devices. Meaning, if I log in to one of this organization's systems and I get a credential, instead of getting an insecure credential that's essentially a password that can be stolen by malware or intercepted by an adversary in the middle, that credential is now cryptographically bound to my device. So if it's stolen, it is no longer useful. It will not give anybody access unless it is on that user's device. And because we're using those hardware roots of trust, we know that that device is running in a secure state capable of protecting that credential. And so it's worthy of allowing that person to have access. And the byproduct of this was fantastic. The byproduct was, because we have strong device identity, because we're issuing credentials that are bound to this device and cannot be stolen and are consistently being renewed, along with making sure the device is constantly trustworthy, they could completely eliminate passwords. They could completely eliminate multi-factor authentication. Students don't have to pull out their phones just to get access to an application that they use every single day, nor did the researchers, nor did the faculty, or the other tens of thousands of employees of the organization. We also showed that this was able to eliminate adversary in the middle attacks and remove the risk associated with malware stealing identity tokens from those devices. Because they're cryptographically bound to the device, malware cannot do anything to exfiltrate that from that device to a malicious actor's device. So it ended up becoming a fantastic experience for their user base, as well as eliminating their core threats, including the ability to address these stringent cybersecurity regulations.
Okay, Chris. So, based on what you were saying, where can we learn and how we can minimize user friction and enhance security without traditional password and MFA prompts?
Well, we would like to invite everybody to attend an in-person session. So there is this QR code on the screen. By all means, please use this QR code to get more information about the event. You can see the date and the location here. And we will personally be present at this event to hear your requirements, hear your challenges, hear your concerns, potentially about emerging threats from artificial intelligence. And we will happily talk to you about what you can do to mitigate these with or without our technology. We would obviously prefer to use the innovation that we've come up with. We know that it's done a tremendous amount of good for our existing customers. But certainly there's a lot to talk about with additional use cases and additional threats. And we'd love to join everybody for that conversation.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. So now we will open it for Q&A session. For all people attending, feel free to type your questions in the chat box so we can answer all them now.
I used to threaten folks when I would give these presentations live that if there's no questions, we'll have to randomly go down the list of invitees and ask them if they have specific questions. But certainly there's more we can talk about.
Excellent. So we have a question. So they were very, he said, thank you for your insightful presentation. It's evident that this field is constantly evolving and your insight have been valuable. How can the cybersecurity community effectively adapt to the evolving landscape, where the development of a new security solution often give rise to equally innovation forms of cyber attack?
Yeah, this is a good question, and it's very true. So cybersecurity attacks have evolved dramatically, and they are not slowing down in their pace of innovation. And I think philosophically, the only way to defeat highly motivated, well-financed, innovative threat actors is for us to be more motivated and to be more innovative. And when I look at this core issue of credential vulnerability, we are essentially using the same technology to grant access to authenticated users today that we've been using since the 1990s, possibly even the 1980s. I need to check my history books. It's time for disruption. It is time for innovation. And to the questioner's point, one day, if we do this disruption and we create a brand new standard and make that standard widespread, eventually, sure, the attackers will find another way. They will change their techniques. They will identify new vulnerabilities and new strategies, but it's going to take them a whole lot of work. If we can start by getting a new paradigm, a new fundamental way of doing things in place, the attackers are going to be stumped for years. And that will buy us quite some time to come up with the next innovations and figure out how to maintain our edge and stay ahead of them, is my belief.
Excellent, nice answer, Mr. Kibis. So now, if for all people attending, if you have additional question, please feel free to write them down now in the Q&A session, so we can answer them now. So we have a question, I guess, now. So they are asking that if this event in Riyadh is open for public, and how can I reach for questions apart from event? So basically, yes, this event is open for public. It will happen on May 15, where Gradient, Mr. Chris, will be with us during this one-day event organized by Saab RDS. It will be in Riyadh at the Marriott Hotel. So we are welcome to join. And for all the questions, we will send you a follow-up email now. We'll give you the details of the event, and you can reach out to us by phone or by email so we can answer all your questions. Also, we have another questions. What makes Gradient a trusted resources?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think in order to best answer that question, we should do an extended session in person at the event. But in short, what I would suggest is a review of the patent portfolio and the underlying technology that we have innovated and come up with. It's not based entirely off of research from our small organization. We started by leveraging well-known open projects, including the MIT Sanctum project, which has gotten a lot of press within the cybersecurity industry. It involves the development of a processor that was evaluated by the US Defense Department and shown to have no vulnerabilities, even through side channel attacks. And they conducted 13,000 hours of red teaming against this without coming up with one. That is the basis for the innovation that we have. What we did is we took that and then added performance, speed, and some additional features around it to make it more of a product that is less technical and more accessible to broader organizations, but it is rooted in that highly advanced world global leading innovation from, frankly, another organization. So I would start there, and then I would go through a more robust description of the security practices, processes, procedures that we have internally to make sure that all facets of our organization are secure. There are easier answers out there. You could point to certifications. SOC 2 Type 2 is very popular, I notice, in the United States, Canada, and potentially other countries. But what I've found is it can be very arduous to obtain certifications, and organizations can do it and pass with flying colors and then still be completely vulnerable to actual cyber attackers, because attackers know what it takes to be compliant, and they know that being compliant and obtaining certifications is not the same as being secure. So our philosophy, and this is a philosophy that I've used personally for many years now, is you have to focus on what is your threat? Who are those that are trying to attack you, and what are their techniques? And if you start there and you build a defensive structure to protect you from that, the compliance is easy. The compliance will fall out from that. But you have to truly understand and know your threat, and then know very explicitly how you've architected your defenses to address every facet of those threats. So I'll stop there, but we should have a longer conversation in person.
Excellent. So we have a question that one of the people attending, Mr. Al-Khansa Stinari, is asking that they have been suffering recently, and other employees from different backgrounds are taking cybersecurity for granted, even though it is dominating and required in all businesses. How can we change this perspective?
That is a fantastic question, and one that has, if it has an answer, the answer is complex and multifaceted. What we're talking about here is a cultural paradigm shift that's necessary. And it sounds like this organization has maybe some pockets where there is not a culture of security. And we've seen that cultures of security are extremely difficult and often absent, even at some of the most sophisticated organizations. Part of me regrets bringing this up, but I think it's important that we talk about it. The most recent, actually the second most recent Microsoft breach from the summer of 2023, when US federal agencies and individuals were compromised because of Microsoft credentials being stolen. The US federal government, who is one of Microsoft's largest and most strategic customers, wrote a report, which was only published 2, perhaps 3 weeks ago now, that was scathing. One of their findings was that Microsoft lacks a culture of security, which is deeply concerning because they're selling a great deal of security products. And I think if you put a fine point on what the government was saying, the US government was saying that, yes, you invest in cybersecurity and sell it, but when it comes to the cybersecurity of your company and your customers, there isn't a sufficient awareness at the leadership level. Where was the CEO board on this critical attack that had widespread ramifications for an entire country? It wasn't sufficiently present. And I think the main takeaway from that is not that Microsoft has a problem they need to fix, although I would argue that Microsoft has a problem they need to fix. I think the main takeaway from that is that culture of security starts from the top. So we need all of our employees, all of those who work for us across our organization, to know that we as leaders take cybersecurity very seriously and hold ourselves accountable. What are we doing for ourselves in our personal lives and in our professional lives for our company, but for our own identities, to make sure that we're not being compromised? How are we showing that we are constantly educating ourselves? And my thought there is that this culture trickles down. People look up to their leaders, and if they see their leaders continuously, constantly showcasing cybersecurity as a core value of they themselves, the employees tend to absorb this, if they're good employees. And if they're not, you should consider maybe putting in some testing that says, well, if employees just can't get a culture of security, then maybe they shouldn't be employees any longer. I've seen this. I've seen this where if employees fail too many security tests, they're fired. And that's not even in security companies. That's in mid-sized banks, not even the largest banks. So culture is critical. Culture starts at the top. There are many ways to evaluate culture and to see whether or not employees are truly absorbing it. And if they're not, you should decide how critical that is to your organization and if you want to take measures to eliminate that.
Excellent, Chris. Thank you for all the answers. Now I have another one. So asking, what is the average cost for a solution that can protect from cyber attacks?
It depends on what the cyber attack is. So we've talked about a root vulnerability that exists at some point in a cyber attack lifecycle. So an attack is not just one thing. An attack is not ransomware. Deploying ransomware is part of a whole operation, an entire life cycle associated with that. So where is it you are trying to prevent the attack from happening? Are you trying to prevent initial access? I would argue that that's almost always impossible. But there are things you can do to mitigate your risk there. So vulnerability management. And there are many, many solutions for vulnerability management that can help you address that. There is malware and the detection of malware through EDR, endpoint detection and response technologies. And then there are things like what Gradient does, which eliminates a broad swath of vulnerabilities from digital credentials and greatly reduce your risk register. And we have standard pricing. It's not posted publicly, so I would ask that we have a conversation about specifics around there. But in general, our observation of the cybersecurity solutions market is that you can get a very effective technology for something on the order of 100 to 200 US dollars per employee per year. And that scales down as the number of employees goes up. And to be clear, sometimes that's one technology, sometimes that's a combination of technologies. But what you want to do is organize the cost of these things by the number of individuals you're trying to protect in your organization, because it's the individuals that are trying to be exploited. They are the gateways to data. They are the gateways to money. So if you protect them, you protect those things. And so try to look at your costs under the umbrella of per user per year.
Excellent. So also another question is, how do we deal with different compliance requirements when it comes to OT and IT collaboration requirements?
Yeah, this is a great question, particularly the OT and IT. What I would highly suggest is investigating the MITRE attack frameworks for both OT and IoT. And do I have a chat? I can put in the spelling there, but it's MITRE. And then attack is spelled ATT ampersand CK. If you just Google those, you'll find them. They are freely available. These are frameworks developed by an organization that exclusively works for the US federal government, but is an expert in the attack lifecycle and conducts and owns the largest source of research on attack life cycles, what adversaries are doing specifically, what they're doing with Microsoft, what they're doing with Google, what they're doing with Apple and Macintosh. And they've done a phenomenal job of organizing both IT and IoT, as well as cloud and other concepts, into a very comprehensive framework. What I would then do, and you might also find this freely available on the internet, but it depends on the regulation, is create a mapping between MITRE attack and the regulatory compliance that you're trying to achieve. So if it's SOC 2 type 2, you can easily map MITRE to SOC 2 type 2, but focus your cybersecurity program, the solutions you're buying, the people you're employing, the processes that you build focus those against MITRE. Do the explanation of how you achieve resistance to the MITRE attack framework, and then let that map and translate to your regulatory environment, because this mirrors what I mentioned earlier. If you follow the threat and what the threat actors are doing and show that you are mitigating that, the compliance stuff will easily fall out from that. And so that's one explicit method that you could use. Start with MITRE attack, map that to your regulatory frameworks, and then show that you're satisfying MITRE.
So in this case, does it require an IT expert in-house to deploy your solutions, or there is an expert from your side to help us out?
I would certainly work with Saab. They are experts in technology and cybersecurity writ large. Gradient is an organization very focused on identity and what we believe to be and know to be one of the core vulnerabilities in the world today. But there are others. And so I think whether you do it in-house or outsource this, either one of those is fine. This is a strategic decision based off of budget, based off of the requirements you're facing as a company. If your regulators or your stakeholders, shareholders in many cases, demand a certain level of support and that requires you to go in-house, well, then you have to make that decision. But it need not be in-house. We see many successful organizations use partners to address all of these requirements comprehensively as well.
Excellent. So the last question about the deep tech event agenda that we are planning to make in Riyadh. So basically, it's a deep tech event where different organizations, mainly from the defense sector, from the telecommunication and research, will be joining us, and we will have multiple speakers from different domains and also from Gradient for the cybersecurity. You will receive the deep agenda of the deep tech event whenever you register. Also, it's available online. You can see the full agenda with the list of speakers. So we can share it with you, and you can receive it very soon whenever once you register. I don't think we have more questions. Thank you for your time with us today. It was very interesting webinar. Thank you, Chris, for joining us. We really appreciate that. We hope that this event was very interesting and useful for the attendees. We are looking forward for further collaboration. Many thanks again, and we will keep in touch.